Hello everyone. I wanted to talk about my trip to Guatemala in 1988, and not that you're so much interested in my trip to Guatemala, but it's a historical nugget and really just trying to capture some history here, as it's been 35 years ago. So anyway, I just thought it'd be interesting to recap that. So 1988 I went to Guatemala, and what's most interesting, I suppose, is I was in some kind of remote areas. It was during a time of disturbance in Guatemala, and decided to share a couple of anecdotes about it. And I mean, the political climate is there was a civil war, but it wasn't, a hot war in some ways. But the most interesting part for me, anyway, at least as far as the historical nugget, was traveling from Flores down to Guatemala City, so it's in that northern area, and going from the Pyramid Tikal down south. And I'll get to that in just a minute. So I took a really cheap flight to Cancun, stayed in a bad hotel in downtown Cancun, went down to Belize City, and then from Belize I went west into Guatemala. And those were kind of easy transports until I got out of Belize, and then that was all by like minibus, and then I got to Tikal, which was fascinating, and there was no one there when I was there. It was in September of '88, and set up my hammock and mosquito net under this little tent thing. And they had some, they had some infrastructure there, certainly, because tourists would go there. But that was really nice. Got to climb around, and in fact, there were some tourists the first day I was there, and we hiked a bit together, and enjoyed it really well. The jungle is very noisy, and I remember when I hiked with them, because it hadn't been long since I'd been in Venezuela, and the whole bugs and jungle thing came right back to me. And I love the jungle, but there's a lot of annoyances too. So that kind of came back, and the loud howler monkeys, and all the noises you get, especially when you're sleeping outside. So one funny thing with Tikal was in the tropics the sun sets very abruptly because of the angle it makes, and so you go from light to dark really fast. And I did not have a flashlight, so suddenly I was plunged into darkness as I was coming from the area, and had to make my way back to my hammock with kind of feeling with my feet, which is not very wise. So, but I enjoyed it. I don't know what you can climb on now, but then you can climb up the pyramids, and that was really pretty. So but then I guess what's most interesting is from there I went down to Guatemala City, and the conveyance was this Jeep thing. It was a Land Cruiser with a bar across the back, and you'd stand. It was a pickup Land Cruiser. You'd stand in the back and hold on to this bar. And I traveled. It took 2 days to get down there. And you just hold on to this bar and make your way. And in some ways I liked it because the roads were really rough, and it's easier to stand than to sit. It's more comfortable. And when it rained, we put a tarp over ourselves, and people would come on and off this thing. And I remember one time a pregnant lady, very pregnant, like 6, 7, 8 months maybe, and she was standing in the back. I thought that was kind of sad that somebody up in the cab did not give up a seat for her. But anyway, that's the way that was. So 2 full days, and then late at night, those of us who were on this Jeep thing got off at this place, this little place, and I remember I didn't have a flashlight, which is funny, and I used the little light in my watch to check the bed for bugs, or to see where I was actually going to sleep, because I wasn't quite sure. So there was no electricity, and it was just this little thing. But I didn't have to set up my hammock. I was able to sleep in a bed, and because I mentioned it, because in Belize, the hotel, whatever, this kind of run-down place I stayed at had ants going across the bed, and they make these ant trails, and I swept them across. And you don't really like to sleep in a bed with bugs, and I had plenty of that in India. So anyway, the bed was clean as far as I could tell, or clean enough. There weren't any bugs in it. So I just thought that was interesting. And then I found a hat. This was during the Civil War. I found a hat that said something on it. I'm not sure what. And this guy said, you shouldn't wear that hat. So it must have been one of the groups that was active there. Went down then to Guatemala City and rented a car. I used to travel a lot at that time. I just started working at a lab, and I had some points with National Rental Car, and I was able to get a rental car. So that was kind of neat. So I drove to Lecatitilan and through Guatemala City and so on with this car, and picked up people sometimes, and they were very gracious in the way they closed the doors. Many indigenous people that well, not many, that's an exaggeration. I didn't pick up that many people, but they're very kind with how they treated the car. They closed the door very gently, and that was nice. And anyway, explored that area, and then as it turns out, Hurricane Gilbert came through, Category 5, peak winds over 180 miles per hour, north of me in Cancun, and I was safe from it. I was way south. And so anyway, when I was going back, I went up through Belize again through the south, and it was difficult to get up into Cancun. And in some ways, I was kind of unwise because I should have just tried to figure out how to fly out from Guatemala City. And but anyway, made it up through Belize and finally up into Cancun again. Which one of the things I thought was interesting was, all the satellite dishes had been torn up and signs were blown all over the place. But then it had this different look to it as I got closer to Cancun, and I realized all the leaves from the palm trees had been blown off, and that's really unusual. So all the leaves were stripped. I was thinking there was something different here besides all the debris thrown around by the hurricane. But yeah, that was interesting. I've never seen that before. So it takes a lot of wind to strip leaves off of palm trees. The airport had been damaged. Part of the roof was collapsed, as I recall. But anyway, I was able to get my flight and get back. I did this between jobs because, especially at that time, the only way I could really travel was to quit a job, it seemed. And that's what I did. So I left one job and went to another job and just squeezed in 3 weeks there. And I just thought that was interesting to see Guatemala at that time. I don't know, I talked about Venezuela earlier, which I knew better. Certainly I was only in Guatemala for 3 weeks. But it was really nice there. But it was very undeveloped in some areas, so it wasn't, well, it was a lot different than India and Southern Asia. I mean, just because there aren't as many people. But it reminded me a lot of Venezuela at that time, the areas I was at anyway. So anyway, a little bonus thought here I thought I'd throw in is sailing. And sailing in the 80s. And I did a couple deliveries. I like to sail, and I chartered boats starting in 86, I think. A beautiful Dickerson 37 was the first charter I had. It was a catch. And that's a long story that I don't think anybody's interested in. But anyway, I was able to skipper that with friends and just did that 2 years ago. I've been doing it for all these years. And so that's been a lot of fun. But I thought I'd talk just briefly as extra on this little video about the delivering boats. And so I enjoyed it. I want to get better at sailing, auxiliary sailing. And I thought, well, a good way to do that is to learn from experts. So I volunteered to deliver boats, and it was really the only big delivery was this transatlantic attempt. We didn't make it. We were going to leave from Cape May and go to England. And when we got about halfway, the boat started leaking. And long story, but we ended up turning back to Newfoundland, and that was interesting. So this was, what was interesting, I suppose, is I got the last fix before we lost all our power. So I had a sextant, and I got a Polaris fix, so I got our latitude anyway before we lost our engine and these kind of things. It wasn't dangerous. It was a really, really slow leak. In fact, it was really, at the end of the day, it was from the anchor bulkhead not being attached well to the hull, and the twisting of the hull from the wave action so it wasn't dangerous. But anyway, but I was a crew on that, so it was good because I got to learn, from a skipper and one of the things I learned from that, because I skippered boats before, was he left a lot of sail up all the time, and that's one thing I learned. He's really trying to make time. I don't know if I learned much more, quite honestly, but he left more sail up than I would normally. Of course, I guess you could argue that's what caused the boat to leak, but that's who knows. So anyway, interesting trip. Really cold. Remember that. Loved seeing the birds out there when I could, and And anyway, that was, and it wasn't like the dark old days. In fact, boats aren't too much different now than they were then. The big difference is navigation and electronics. There was no AIS, no GPS, these kind of things that helped. So I remember one time coming back from I went to the Bahamas before, but we were going to the Bahamas, turned back because everybody got seasick except for me. So I was coming back into Miami, I guess it was, trying to find the entrance buoy, which is really hard. You get the lights in Miami. And I've had a couple of cases like that. It's scary. There's nothing good about it. So you're scanning into the darkness with your binoculars looking for a buoy. And yeah, GPS is a lot easier. In fact, it's funny with electronic charts, now that I've used those, it's like a big video game. You just sort of stay in the lines and so on. It makes it a lot easier, but I remember that sort of thing. So anyway, just wanted to share some thoughts about Guatemala in 1988 and sailing even before that. And thank you for your time.